Daphne darted ahead on the trail, her laughter ringing through the crisp mountain air. She loved this, the challenge, the thrill, the way the uneven terrain seemed to welcome her wild spirit. Dean had always said she had her mother's fire, her boundless energy. It was that same energy that had pushed Daphne to conquer every peak and trail she could find. Today, her boyfriend, Nolan, was the one trying to keep up, shaking his head with an affectionate grin every time she dared to take a jump from one rock to another. "Slow down, Daphne," he called out. "These rocks are slippery. You're going to." "Relax, Nolan. I've got this," she interrupted, her voice full of confidence. She didn't, not really. The trail was rugged, with loose stones scattered over narrow paths. But Daphne wasn't one to shy away from a challenge. Her mother, her idol and the source of so much of her strength, had taught her that life was meant to be lived boldly. Losing her when she was just a girl had been the hardest thing Daphne had ever faced, and since then, she'd vowed to take risks, to feel alive in every moment. Dean, her patient and steady father, supported her adventurous streak, though it left him biting his nails more often than he'd admit. Daphne reached a section of jagged rocks, slick with a recent rain. Nolan's words echoed faintly in her mind as she gauged the distance to the next flat spot. She hesitated only briefly before leaping, her foot catching the edge awkwardly. Her arms flailed as she scrambled to regain her footing, but the slick surface betrayed her. Her stomach lurched as she felt herself falling. A sharp, searing pain tore through her leg as the world tilted. She landed hard, her cry of pain echoing through the quiet wilderness. Above her, a massive rock teetered, dislodged by her fall, and with an ominous groan, it crashed down onto her leg. The world around her blurred. Nolan was suddenly there, his face pale and panicked as he tried to assess the situation. His voice sounded distant, muffled, like it was coming from underwater. The pain was like nothing she had ever felt before, hot and consuming, and all she could think was that this wasn't supposed to happen. She was supposed to be invincible, unstoppable. When she opened her eyes again, the world was sterile and white. The sharp scent of antiseptic replaced the mountain air, and the steady beeping of monitors filled her ears. Her body felt heavy, and her head throbbed as though it were filled with cotton. She blinked, trying to focus, as a familiar voice broke through the haze. "Daphne? Sweetheart, can you hear me?" It was Dean. His voice, always so steady and comforting, was trembling. She turned her head toward him slowly, her throat dry as sandpaper. He was sitting beside her bed, his face lined with worry and exhaustion. "Dad," she croaked, her voice barely a whisper. Dean's hand found hers, warm and steady. "I'm here. You're going to be okay." She wanted to believe him, but something felt off, wrong in a way she couldn't immediately place. Her legs felt strangely numb, and when she tried to shift, a dull ache radiated through her body. "Dad, what happened?" Dean hesitated, his grip tightening on her hand. He looked down, composing himself before meeting her gaze. "Daphne," he began, his voice low but firm, "you were in an accident on the trail. It was bad, your leg was crushed by a rock. The doctors did everything they could, but they had to amputate your leg below the knee to save your life." His words hit her like a blow, her mind struggling to process the weight of what he was saying. Amputated. Her leg was gone. She stared at him, her mouth opening and closing as she tried to form a response, but no words came. Dean reached out, his other hand brushing a strand of hair from her face. "I know this is a lot to take in, sweetheart, but you're still here. You're alive. We'll figure this out together." The enormity of it crashed over her, and tears began to stream down her face, silent and uncontrollable. Dean moved to sit on the edge of the bed, wrapping her in his arms as sobs racked her body. He held her tightly, murmuring words of reassurance, though they felt like they were coming from a great distance. She couldn't stop replaying it in her mind, the trail, the rocks, the moment the world shifted and her body betrayed her. She'd been careless, overconfident, and now she was different. Broken. Dean held her until the sobs subsided, his hands never leaving her shoulders. When she finally pulled back, her face streaked with tears, she looked at him, her eyes searching for something, answers, comfort, hope. "How am I supposed to live like this?" she whispered, her voice hollow. "You will," Dean said firmly, his eyes filled with conviction. "You're one of the strongest people I know. You've faced loss before, Daphne, and you came out stronger. This won't be easy, but you're not doing it alone. I'm with you, every step of the way." His faith in her was unshakable, but it only made the weight in her chest heavier. She didn't feel strong. She felt like a shadow of the girl she used to be, the girl who ran ahead on the trail without a second thought. That girl was gone, and in her place was someone she barely recognized. Dean stayed by her side, talking softly about the steps they would take next, but Daphne's mind was elsewhere. All she could think about was everything she had lost, the freedom, the confidence, the sense that she could do anything. It all felt impossibly far away now. As night fell and the hospital room grew quiet, Daphne stared at the ceiling, her thoughts a tangled mess. She had always prided herself on her strength, her independence. Now, all of that felt stripped away. Dean had fallen asleep in the chair beside her, his head resting against the wall. She glanced at him, her heart aching at the worry etched into his features. He'd always been her rock, her steady foundation, and she hated the thought of adding to his burdens. But as much as she wanted to take comfort in his words, to believe they could face this together, the truth was inescapable. She felt shattered, and no amount of reassurance could piece her back together. Not yet. The hospital lights buzzed softly, casting a dim glow across the room. Daphne closed her eyes, her tears soaking the pillow beneath her. She didn't know what the future would look like or how she could possibly move forward. All she knew was that everything had changed, and she wasn't sure how to find her way again. Nolan sat in his car outside the hospital, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. The dashboard clock ticked mercilessly, marking each moment he spent paralyzed by indecision. He'd parked here twice already this week, always leaving without stepping foot inside. He couldn't bring himself to face her. Every time he thought about walking into that hospital room, his chest tightened, and his breath caught in his throat. The image of Daphne falling replayed over and over in his mind, a cruel loop he couldn't shut off. He'd let her take the lead on that trail, laughing at her boldness, marveling at her confidence. He should have stopped her, held her back. Instead, she was in there, and he was out here, whole and unscathed, while she bore the consequences. The thought made him sick. He couldn't stop imagining the expression she'd wear when she saw him. Would she blame him? Hate him? Worse, what if she didn't even want to see him? He wasn't sure he deserved her forgiveness. Inside the hospital, Daphne lay in her bed, staring at the ceiling. The minutes passed sluggishly, each one dragging her deeper into a haze of frustration and grief. The nurses moved about the room in quiet efficiency, checking machines, fluffing pillows, offering polite smiles that felt more like pity. She hated the pity. Worse than that, though, was the absence. Days had passed, and Nolan hadn't come. She had convinced herself he would show up right away, racing through the halls, desperate to be by her side. But he hadn't. And now the silence in her room was deafening. She heard snippets of conversation when the nurses thought she wasn't listening. They spoke in low tones, unaware their words carried to her ears. Her boyfriend was with her, wasn't he? Came out without a scratch. Lucky guy. Lucky, Daphne muttered under her breath. The word twisted something in her chest. She knew what they meant, but it felt like a knife all the same. He was lucky to be fine. Lucky to still have both legs. Lucky to walk away without being chained to this hospital bed or this overwhelming sense of loss. The idea began to burrow deep inside her. Nolan hadn't come because he didn't want to. She pictured him, whole and healthy, going about his life, relieved he no longer had to deal with her. The accident had changed everything for her, but maybe, for him, it was just an escape. She tried to shove the thought away, but it lingered, dark and heavy, feeding on her worst fears. When the door finally opened and she saw him standing there, her chest tightened. Nolan looked smaller somehow, as though guilt had physically shrunk him. His hands were shoved into the pockets of his jacket, his shoulders slumped. "Hey," he said softly, his voice tentative. Daphne didn't respond immediately. She'd rehearsed this moment a dozen times in her head, and yet now, with him standing in front of her, she felt unprepared. A wall went up almost automatically, a shield she could hide behind. "You finally made it," she said coolly, her tone sharper than she intended. Nolan flinched but stepped closer. I know I should have come sooner. I didn't know what to say, Daph. I didn't know how to. Didn't know how to what? Look at me. See what's left?" The bitterness in her voice surprised even her, but once it was out, she couldn't stop. "I get it. You don't have to pretend like you care." Nolan's eyes widened, the pain on his face unmistakable. "That's not true. Don't say that. I've been a mess. I couldn't stop thinking about you, about what happened. It's my fault." Daphne shook her head, her jaw tight. "It's not about fault, Nolan. It's about the fact that I'm here, and you weren't. You left me alone to figure this out." "What does that say?" "I was scared," he admitted, his voice breaking slightly. "I didn't know how to face you. I thought if I came, I'd just make things worse." "You did make it worse," she shot back. "By staying away. You made it clear exactly how you feel." Nolan ran a hand through his hair, his frustration evident. "That's not fair. You have no idea how hard this has been for me." "Hard for you?" Daphne's voice rose, her anger spilling over. "You can walk out of here and go back to your life like nothing happened. Look at me, Nolan. My life is never going to be the same. You don't get to come in here and make this about you." He stepped back, his hands dropping to his sides. He looked like he'd been punched, but Daphne didn't let up. "You should go," she said, her tone flat now, the anger giving way to exhaustion. "We both know this isn't going to work. You don't want to be here, and I don't want to be someone you feel obligated to visit. Just go." Nolan hesitated, his mouth opening as though he wanted to protest. But something in her expression stopped him. Maybe it was the steel in her eyes, or the way she seemed to fold in on herself, like she'd already closed the door on him in her mind. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. Daphne didn't respond, didn't look at him again. She kept her gaze fixed on the far wall, willing herself not to cry, not to show him just how deeply this moment was cutting her. Nolan lingered for a moment longer, then turned and walked out of the room, the door clicking softly behind him. The silence that followed was suffocating. Daphne let out a shaky breath, her hands clenched tightly around the blanket draped over her lap. She had told herself this was what she wanted, to end it before he could hurt her any more than she already hurt. But the emptiness that settled in her chest felt like a hollow victory. She stared at the door long after he was gone, the weight of her decision pressing down on her. It was better this way, she told herself. It had to be. Letting him stay would have been worse. Wouldn't it? Daphne stared at the parallel bars in the therapy room, her reflection staring back at her from the mirrored wall beyond them. The metal gleamed under the fluorescent lights, a silent challenge, daring her to step forward. She hated them, the bars, the therapist's encouraging voices, the endless repetition of motions that felt pointless. The room itself felt suffocating, with its scent of antiseptic and the sound of equipment whirring in the background. She gripped the cool steel with clammy hands, the prosthetic leg feeling foreign and cumbersome as she tried to shift her weight. "Just one step today, Daphne," the therapist said gently, her tone laced with an optimism that only fueled Daphne's irritation. It wasn't that she didn't want to improve. Some part of her, buried deep, longed to feel whole again. But the process felt impossible. Every movement seemed like a mountain to climb, and the progress was so slow it hardly seemed worth it. The frustration burned hotter each time she stumbled, each time her muscles ached, each time her balance betrayed her. "I think that's enough," Daphne muttered, letting go of the bars and sinking back into her wheelchair. Her hands trembled as she rubbed them on her thighs, avoiding the therapist's eyes. "You did well today," the therapist replied, though her cheerfulness was met with silence. Daphne wheeled herself out of the room, the knot in her chest tightening as she passed other patients who seemed to be handling their therapy with grace. She wondered if they ever felt like screaming into a pillow or throwing the equipment out the nearest window. At home, she found comfort in her books and coursework. They didn't demand anything of her except focus, and she was good at that. The numbers and formulas in her business classes didn't judge her for needing a chair to move around or a prosthetic to stand. They didn't stare at her like she was an object of pity. Dean, as always, watched her with quiet concern. He never pushed too hard, never forced her to talk about therapy or the sessions she skipped. Instead, he found ways to leave the door open, hoping she might step through when she was ready. "You're really killing it in that economics class, huh?" he said one evening, sitting across from her at the dining table. Daphne's textbooks and notes were spread out in a careful arrangement, her highlighter poised in her hand. "It's fine," she replied, not looking up. "More than fine. You're ahead of schedule with your assignments." She shrugged, her focus remaining on the textbook. "I like staying busy." Dean leaned back in his chair, his expression softening. "You've always been like that. When you were little, you'd color for hours, and I'd come in thinking you'd gotten bored, but you'd be halfway through another masterpiece. Always so determined." Daphne paused, her highlighter hovering over the page. "That was different." "Not really," Dean said gently. "You've got that same determination now. I see it every day. You don't give yourself enough credit." She didn't respond, the words not quite sinking in. She wanted to believe him, but the gulf between who she'd been and who she was now felt insurmountable. Days turned into weeks, and Daphne's world narrowed to the walls of their home and the flickering light of her laptop screen. She buried herself in her studies, pouring her energy into excelling academically. Every completed assignment and high grade gave her a fleeting sense of accomplishment, a small piece of control in a life that often felt untethered. But the isolation grew heavier with time. Daphne avoided the few friends who still reached out, letting their texts sit unanswered. She ignored the social invitations she once would have jumped at. The thought of stepping back into the world, of facing the stares and awkward conversations, made her stomach twist. It was easier to stay in her bubble, safe from the judgment she feared. Dean noticed the change but tread lightly, his patience seemingly endless. One evening, as Daphne worked at the table, he set down a plate of cookies and sat across from her, his expression unreadable. "Remember when you used to talk about running your own business someday?" he asked casually, breaking the silence. Daphne looked up, startled by the question. "What about it?" "I was just thinking how good you'd be at it. You've got the brains and the drive. Always have." She snorted softly, her gaze dropping back to her notes. "Yeah, well, that was before." "Before what?" She hesitated, her hands tightening around her pen. "Before everything. Before I became this." Dean frowned, leaning forward. "Daph, you're not a this. You're you. You're my kid, and you're capable of so much more than you realize." His words hung in the air, but she couldn't meet his eyes. She felt a lump forming in her throat, but she swallowed it down, masking the emotion with a curt nod. "You don't get it," she said quietly. You don't know what it feels like to have people look at you like you're broken. I don't, Dean admitted, his voice steady. But I do know that you're the strongest person I've ever met. And I know you're going to do amazing things, no matter how long it takes you to figure that out. The earnestness in his voice made something in Daphne's chest ache. She wanted to believe him, to see herself through his eyes, but the weight of her insecurities was suffocating. She turned back to her notes, ending the conversation without another word. Dean didn't press further. He just sat there for a while, watching her with the quiet, unshakable love that had been her anchor through every storm. As the weeks went on, Daphne kept her head down, her focus unwavering. The world beyond their home felt like an abstract idea, a place she could imagine but wasn't ready to return to. Dean continued to plant seeds of encouragement, hoping one might take root. One night, as she closed her laptop and prepared to head to bed, he spoke up from his armchair, his tone casual but intentional. You're going to have to step out there eventually, you know. Daphne paused, glancing over her shoulder. What's that supposed to mean? It means you're brilliant, and the world could use more of that brilliance. Hiding away might feel safe, but it's not where you're meant to stay. Her lips pressed into a thin line, a retort forming on her tongue, but she held it back. Instead, she muttered a quick goodnight and retreated to her room, his words lingering long after she closed the door. In the quiet of her space, surrounded by books and notes, Daphne lay in bed staring at the ceiling. Her father's voice echoed in her mind, the words both comforting and unsettling. She didn't want to admit it, but a small part of her wondered if he was right. Maybe there was more waiting for her. Maybe she just needed to find the courage to look for it. Daphne adjusted the strap of her messenger bag, her fingers fumbling as she tried to keep her cane steady. Her reflection in the hallway mirror stared back at her, offering no reassurance. She hated the business casual look, slacks that never fit quite right and blouses that felt stiff, like costumes she hadn't fully grown into. But this was her new reality, and she had promised Dean she'd give it a real shot. Do you have your lunch? Dean asked from the kitchen, his voice light, but his words betrayed the concern he tried to hide. Got it, she called back, trying to sound more confident than she felt. Dean emerged, wiping his hands on a dish towel, his kind smile softening her tension. You're going to be great today. Just remember, you've already done the hardest part, getting there. Daphne managed a small smile but didn't respond. The hardest part, she thought bitterly, was not letting the self-doubt swallow her whole. The commute to the logistics firm was a mix of nerves and monotony. Every step out of her comfort zone felt amplified, the curious glances at her cane, the steady rhythm of her uneven gait against the concrete. She kept her focus ahead, silently reciting her father's pep talk from the morning. The office buzzed with energy, a mix of clicking keyboards and low voices murmuring over spreadsheets. Daphne's supervisor, a no-nonsense woman named Claire, introduced her to the team, emphasizing Daphne's sharp mind and impressive academic record. Claire's praise sounded genuine, but Daphne couldn't shake the feeling that it was more of an obligation, a way to compensate for what people must have assumed she lacked. Her desk was tucked in a quiet corner, a small mercy as she adjusted to the overwhelming environment. She focused on organizing the files Claire had handed her, the structured tasks calming her restless thoughts. Logistics wasn't glamorous, but there was something satisfying about the puzzles it presented. By the end of the day, her head throbbed, and her muscles ached, but she'd completed her assignments with precision. Claire even stopped by her desk to commend her efficiency, but the compliment felt like a fleeting moment of relief, quickly overshadowed by the ever-present hum of inadequacy. At home, Dean greeted her with the enthusiasm of someone who had been rooting for her all day. How was it? He asked, setting a steaming cup of tea on the counter for her. Fine, Daphne replied, sliding onto a stool. Dean raised an eyebrow. Fine as in good fine or I don't want to talk about it, fine? She gave a faint smirk, wrapping her hands around the warm mug. Somewhere in between. I didn't mess anything up, but I don't know. It feels like everyone else knows what they're doing, and I'm just trying to keep up. Dean leaned on the counter, his face soft with understanding. You're new. No one expects you to have it all figured out on day one. What matters is that you showed up and gave it your all. That's what people will remember. Maybe, she said quietly, not entirely convinced. The weeks that followed were a roller coaster of emotions. Each morning, Daphne wrestled with the urge to stay in bed, to sink back into the comfort of her quiet world. But the commitment she had made to herself, and to Dean, kept her moving. Her tasks at the firm grew more complex, requiring her to analyze data and coordinate with other departments. She proved adept at streamlining workflows and identifying inefficiencies, skills she had honed during her coursework. Her colleagues started coming to her with questions, even complimenting her innovative suggestions during team meetings. But even with those small victories, the nagging voice in her head refused to be silenced. She noticed how effortlessly her peers navigated social interactions, laughing and chatting during breaks while she sat at her desk, trying to blend into the background. The fear of saying the wrong thing, of drawing attention to herself, kept her silent. One afternoon, Claire stopped by Daphne's desk with a printout. Great work on this, she said, tapping the paper. I shared your suggestions with upper management, and they're really impressed. Keep it up. Daphne murmured a quiet thanks, the weight of Claire's words unable to penetrate the wall of self-doubt. That evening, as she recounted the day to Dean, she downplayed the accomplishment. It was just a spreadsheet, she said, shrugging. Dean set down his coffee cup and gave her a pointed look. It wasn't just a spreadsheet. You took initiative. You offered something valuable, and they noticed. You've got to stop minimizing your wins, Daph. They matter. She rolled her eyes but couldn't help the small smile that crept onto her face. You're relentless, you know that? It's part of the job, he said, grinning. Despite his encouragement, the weight of her insecurities lingered. The routine of leaving the house every day, navigating the stairs and assumptions, took its toll. There were nights when she sat in her room, staring at her prosthetic leg propped in the corner, wondering if she'd ever feel like herself again. But there were also moments, however fleeting, when she allowed herself to feel proud. The compliments from her supervisors, the progress she made in therapy, the fact that she was even here, all of it was evidence that she was moving forward, even if it didn't always feel like it. One Saturday, Dean surprised her by setting up a small celebration. The kitchen table was covered in her favorite snacks, and a handwritten banner that read, "Daphne Rocks," hung crookedly above the doorway. What is this? She asked, laughing as she took in the scene. It's a reminder, he said, handing her a cupcake. That you're amazing, even if you don't always believe it. Daphne rolled her eyes, but her heart swelled. You're such a dork, she teased. Guilty, Dean replied, pulling her into a hug. In the quiet moments that followed, as they sat together eating cupcakes, Daphne allowed herself to feel a flicker of something she hadn't felt in a long time, hope. The path wasn't easy, and her doubts didn't vanish overnight. But each step she took, each task she completed at work, each session she endured at therapy, chipped away at the walls she had built around herself. And through it all, Dean remained her constant, cheering her on with the unwavering belief that one day, she might finally see what he saw in her. Daphne adjusted her grip on her cane, shifting the weight of her messenger bag on her shoulder. The day had been long, filled with spreadsheets and logistics meetings, and her feet ached from navigating the uneven city sidewalks. She was looking forward to the quiet of her apartment, where she could kick off her shoes and let the day fade away. The street hummed with late afternoon energy, businesspeople rushing to catch trains, couples strolling arm in arm, the occasional burst of laughter from a sidewalk cafe. As she turned the corner near her building, a flash of blonde hair caught her eye. Daphne's breath hitched when she realized it was Emily Parker, the effortlessly radiant girl who had been the queen of their high school. Emily stood in front of a boutique window, her reflection as flawless as the designer outfit she wore. She was holding a shopping bag in one hand and laughing into her phone, the picture of effortless sophistication. Daphne's stomach tightened. Seeing Emily was like being thrust back into the crowded halls of high school, where Emily's confidence seemed untouchable and Daphne had felt invisible. She remembered how Emily had always seemed to glide through life, her beauty and charm opening every door. Now, even years later, nothing appeared to have changed. Daphne slowed her pace, torn between ducking into the nearest alley to avoid being seen and forcing herself to walk by as if she didn't care. But as her mind spiraled, dissecting every awkward encounter they'd had as teenagers, her focus slipped. Her cane caught on a crack in the pavement, her balance wavered, and her body jolted forward. Before she could steady herself, the edge of her cane scraped against the side of a glossy black luxury car parked just ahead. The sound of metal meeting metal sent a chill down her spine. She froze, staring at the faint scratch marring the otherwise pristine paint. Her heart began to race as the realization of what had happened sank in. She glanced around, her face growing hot. Emily, thankfully, hadn't noticed, still absorbed in her phone call. But Daphne's relief was short-lived as the car door opened, and a man stepped out. She braced herself, gripping her cane tightly as she tried to compose herself. The man, tall and sharply dressed, closed the door behind him and turned to assess the damage. His gaze swept over the scratch before landing on her, his expression unreadable. I'm so sorry," Daphne stammered, her voice trembling. "I wasn't paying attention. I tripped, Anne." Her words trailed off as his eyes met hers, dark and steady, though his brows were slightly furrowed. He didn't immediately respond, instead running a hand through his hair as he exhaled. His silence only made her feel more exposed, the heat in her cheek spreading. "I really didn't mean to," she started again, but he held up a hand, stopping her mid-sentence. "It's fine," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Are you okay?" Daphne froze when she heard the voice. When she saw his face, her breath caught. It was Nolan. The years hadn't dulled her memory of him, but seeing him now felt surreal. He looked every bit the professional, his sharp suit tailored perfectly, his hair carefully styled, his movements confident. Yet, there was a flicker of something in his expression as their eyes met, surprise, maybe even disbelief. "Daphne?" he asked, his voice lower and steadier than she remembered, but undeniably his. She swallowed hard, wishing the ground would open up and swallow her. "Hi," she managed, her voice barely audible. For a moment, neither of them moved, the tension thick and awkward. Nolan's gaze flicked to the scratch on his car, then back to her. His expression softened, but his surprise lingered. I, he said, taking a hesitant step forward. "Are you okay?" The question caught her off guard. She expected him to be annoyed or angry about the scratch. Instead, he was looking at her with something she couldn't quite place, concern, maybe. "I'm fine," she said quickly, adjusting her cane as if to prove it. He studied her, his brow furrowing slightly. "You sure?" Her face flushed. She hated feeling exposed, hated the way his eyes seemed to take in everything, the cane, her discomfort, the way she was clearly flustered. "I'm fine," she repeated, her voice sharper this time. I tripped. I wasn't paying attention." Nolan glanced at the scratch on his car again and exhaled, shaking his head slightly. "It's just a car," he said, his tone calm. "Don't worry about it." His response should have put her at ease, but it only made her feel worse. She fumbled for something to say, her thoughts scattered. "I'm sorry," she muttered. "I should have been more careful." "It's okay, really," he said, his tone gentle now. "Daphne, I didn't expect to see you." She winced inwardly. That made two of them. Seeing him again wasn't something she'd prepared for, and now she felt like she was standing on stage in a spotlight she never wanted. "Yeah," she said, keeping her tone neutral. It's been a while. His expression shifted, the corners of his mouth tugging downward. A long while. Silence stretched between them, heavy and filled with unspoken things. Daphne shifted her weight uncomfortably, gripping her cane tighter. "So, how have you been?" he asked, the question tentative. She almost laughed. How had she been? It felt like the kind of question you asked an old classmate you bumped into at the grocery store, not someone who used to know you better than anyone. But she didn't have the energy to unpack it. "I've been fine," she said, the answer automatic. His gaze lingered on her, as if he didn't quite believe her. "You're living here now?" She nodded. "Yeah. It's close to work." "What do you do?" Her chest tightened at the question, but she kept her voice even. "I'm an intern at a logistics firm." Nolan smiled faintly, a flicker of something warm passing over his face. "That sounds like a lot of work." "I'm not surprised. You always were good at figuring things out." The compliment caught her off guard, but she didn't let it show. She shrugged, brushing it off. "It's just an internship. Nothing special." His expression shifted again, a shadow of regret flickering in his eyes. "Daphne. I don't," she interrupted, her voice firmer now. He stopped, his mouth half open, as if the words had been yanked from him. "I know what you're going to say," she continued, her tone flat. "It doesn't matter. It was a long time ago." "It does matter," he said quietly. Her jaw tightened, but she shook her head. "It doesn't. We were kids. It's ancient history. Let's not do this." Nolan took a small step closer, his expression earnest. "I messed up back then. I should have been there for you, but I was scared, and you weren't," she finished for him, her voice sharp. "We don't need to rehash it, Nolan. It's done. I've moved on." The look on his face told her he didn't believe that. But he didn't push back. He just stood there, the weight of everything unsaid hanging between them. She adjusted her cane, her fingers trembling slightly. "I need to go," she said, her voice quieter now. Nolan nodded slowly, stepping back to give her space. "Okay," he said softly. "But if you ever want to talk." "I don't," she said quickly, cutting him off. He hesitated, his gaze lingering on her for a moment longer. Then he nodded again, his jaw tightening. "Take care, Daphne." She turned without responding, her heart pounding as she walked toward her apartment building. She didn't look back, even though she could feel his eyes on her. When she finally closed the door behind her, she leaned against it, exhaling shakily. Her hands trembled as she set her cane aside, the weight of the encounter pressing down on her like a stone. She hated how raw she felt, how easily he had shaken her composure. She'd spent years building walls around herself, protecting the fragile parts of her that still ached when she thought about him. And now, with just a few words and a single glance, he'd managed to crack those walls. Daphne wiped at her eyes angrily, refusing to let herself cry. Nolan was part of her past, a chapter she had closed long ago. She couldn't let him waltz back into her life and stir up feelings she had buried. She sank onto the couch, staring at the ceiling as the day's events played out in her mind. The scratch, the awkward reunion, the look in his eyes when he'd said her name. No, she thought firmly. She wouldn't let herself go down that path again. Nolan was the past. And she had worked too hard to build her present to let him ruin it. Daphne's phone buzzed on her desk, breaking her concentration on the spreadsheet she had been dissecting for hours. She glanced at the screen, already knowing who it was. Nolan. His persistence was becoming something she couldn't ignore, no matter how much she wanted to. He'd been texting on and off since their awkward reunion, each message polite, warm, and utterly impossible to delete without reading. This time, the message was simple: "Lunch? My treat." I'll be good, I promise. She leaned back in her chair, staring at the words. Part of her wanted to say no, to keep the distance she had worked so hard to build. But there was another part, a smaller, quieter voice, that was curious. Against her better judgment, she found herself typing back, okay. Just lunch. The cafe was cozy, tucked away on a quiet street. Nolan had picked a table by the window, and when Daphne arrived, he stood, his familiar smile disarming her before she could think too much about it. Hey, he said, pulling out her chair. She nodded in greeting, settling into the seat with a mix of apprehension and determination. Hi. The awkwardness lingered for only a moment before the conversation began to flow. Nolan had a way of easing into topics, his humor disarming, his tone light. They talked about the city, the strange quirks of their jobs, and the embarrassing moments they'd both endured in high school. Do you remember that time in math class? He asked, laughing. When Mr. Patterson called on me to solve that equation, and I just froze? Daphne smirked, shaking her head. You said, I think the answer is probably subjective. I don't think I've ever seen a teacher's face turn that red. He grinned. Well, I had to make up for it somehow. That's why I asked you to tutor me. You didn't need tutoring, she said, raising an eyebrow. Sure, I did. I also needed an excuse to spend more time with you, he admitted, his smile softening. Daphne's breath caught for just a second, but she quickly brushed off the compliment with a small laugh. You were terrible at equations. That part wasn't an act. They both laughed, and for the first time in a long while, Daphne felt a little of her guard slip away. When they parted ways, Nolan walked her to her car, his hands tucked into his coat pockets. Thanks for saying yes, he said as she opened her door. I missed this. I missed you. Daphne looked at him, her thoughts swirling. She didn't know how to respond, so she simply nodded, slipping into the driver's seat. As she drove home, she realized she was smiling. A few days later, her phone buzzed again. This time, Nolan suggested drinks. She hesitated, but the memory of their easy conversation over lunch lingered in her mind. Against her usual instincts, she said yes. The bar was lively, with dim lighting and music humming softly in the background. Nolan arrived first, waving her over to a small table near the back. I promise not to overwhelm you with nostalgia this time, he joked, sliding a menu across to her. Daphne smiled, feeling a little more at ease than she had expected. They ordered drinks, and as the evening unfolded, the conversation shifted to their current lives. So, Nolan said, leaning forward slightly, how's the internship going? It's good, she replied, hesitating. I mean, I'm learning a lot, and I think I'm doing okay. But. She toyed with the edge of her napkin. It's just. I want to stay on permanently, but I don't know how to make that happen. I don't know if I'm good enough. Nolan frowned, his expression thoughtful. Why would you think that? She sighed, her words tumbling out before she could stop them. Because I feel like I'm constantly playing catch-up. Everyone else seems so confident, so sure of themselves, and I'm just trying not to mess up. Daphne, he said gently, I've seen you in action, even back in high school. You're brilliant. And from what you've told me about your job, you're already proving yourself. Have you talked to your supervisor about your goals? Not really, she admitted. I don't know how to bring it up without sounding. I don't know, desperate? You're not desperate. You're ambitious, he said firmly. And that's a good thing. Here's what you do, find a moment when you're working on something you're proud of, and bring it up then. Frame it as a conversation about your contributions and how you want to grow within the company. You're not asking for a favor, you're showing them you're invested. Daphne considered his words, nodding slowly. That makes sense. It works, he said with a confident smile. Trust me, I've used it more than once. She chuckled softly, the tension in her chest easing. Thanks. I needed that. Anytime, he said, raising his glass in a small toast. As the evening went on, Daphne began to feel the weight of the crowd around them. The bar had grown busier, the space tighter, and she stood to excuse herself. But as she maneuvered through the narrow walkway, her cane caught on the leg of a chair, and she wobbled. Before she could fall, Nolan was there, his hands steadying her shoulders. Got you, he said, his voice calm. Daphne felt her face flush, but his grip was reassuring, not pitying. She straightened herself, muttering, "Thanks. I'm fine." "I know," he said, his hands dropping away as he stepped back. "But I'm here if you need me." The simplicity of his words settled over her, quiet and warm. As they left the bar later that evening, Daphne found herself glancing at Nolan out of the corner of her eye. She still wasn't sure what to make of him, of his persistence, his kindness, his willingness to show up. But a small part of her couldn't help wondering if maybe, just maybe, it was worth letting him try. Daphne could hardly sit still at her desk, her heart thudding in her chest as she reread the email on her screen. The subject line was simple: "Congratulations on your new role." The message itself confirmed what she'd barely dared to hope for: she had been offered a full-time position at the firm. She had done it. Her first instinct was to call her father, but before she could reach for her phone, another thought bubbled to the surface. Nolan. He had been the one to encourage her, to show her how to approach the conversation with her supervisor. Without his advice, she might never have found the nerve. Without giving herself time to overthink, she texted him, "I got the job. Full-time." The reply came back almost immediately, "That's amazing. Let's celebrate. Where are you?" By the time Daphne stepped outside, Nolan was waiting by his car, leaning against the door with a wide grin. His excitement was infectious, and as she approached, she couldn't hold back her smile. "I knew you'd get it," he said, his voice full of warmth. Before she could stop herself, Daphne stepped forward and hugged him, the motion as impulsive as her joy. His arms wrapped around her briefly, steady and sure, but the realization of what she'd done hit her, and she pulled back, her cheeks burning. "Sorry," she muttered, smoothing her hair. "I just..." "Don't apologize," Nolan said, his smile softening. "You've got every reason to celebrate." The words settled her nerves, and for the rest of the evening, the two of them wandered the city, grabbing coffee and walking through the park. Daphne felt a lightness she hadn't experienced in years, the kind of happiness that seemed to expand with every step. When she returned home that night, Dean was waiting for her in the kitchen, a hopeful look on his face. "Well?" he asked, setting down the newspaper he hadn't been reading. "I got it," she said, her voice tinged with disbelief. His face lit up, and in an instant, he was on his feet, pulling her into a hug. "I'm so proud of you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You've worked so hard for this, Daphne. You deserve it." She smiled against his shoulder, her heart swelling. Dean had been her rock through everything, and seeing his pride meant more than any email or handshake ever could. In the weeks that followed, Daphne settled into her new role with a newfound sense of purpose. The weight of uncertainty that had followed her for so long began to lift, replaced by a quiet confidence that grew with each accomplishment. Her sessions at therapy were no longer just a chore. She approached them with determination, pushing herself further with every visit. The prosthetic she had once resented now felt like an extension of her, and though the process wasn't without its challenges, she began to see her strength in a way she hadn't before. One evening, as she sat on her porch with her laptop, reviewing notes for a presentation, her thoughts drifted to Nolan. Their friendship, if that was the right word, had become a steady presence in her life. He had a way of showing up exactly when she needed him, whether it was a text of encouragement or an impromptu coffee run. She closed her laptop, her fingers tapping idly on the table as she considered something she had been too afraid to admit. She wanted more. The thought scared her. Letting him in fully meant taking a risk, and she wasn't sure she was ready for that. But another voice, quieter but no less insistent, reminded her how far she'd come. She picked up her phone before she could second-guess herself and typed out a message. "Are you free Friday? I was thinking we could grab dinner." Her finger hovered over the send button, but then she took a deep breath and tapped it. The response came quickly. "Dinner sounds great. Pick you up at 7? Daphne smiled, her heart racing as she typed back, 7 works. But I mean, dinner like, a date. The response came quickly again. "That is perfect." The days leading up to Friday passed in a blur, her nerves building with each passing hour. By the time the evening arrived, she was pacing her living room, trying not to overanalyze her reflection in the mirror. Dean walked in, taking one look at her and grinning. "You've got that look," he teased, leaning against the doorframe. "What look?" she asked, feigning nonchalance. "I'm going on a date, and I'm nervous but pretending not to be." "Look," he said, crossing his arms. Daphne rolled her eyes, but her smile gave her away. "It's not a big deal," she said, adjusting the hem of her dress. "Sure it isn't," Dean replied, his grin widening. "You look great, by the way." Before she could respond, the sound of a car pulling up outside caught her attention. She glanced out the window, her heart skipping as she saw Nolan step out. Dean gave her a knowing look. "Don't keep him waiting." As she opened the door, Nolan turned, his smile lighting up as he saw her. "Wow," he said, his tone full of admiration. "You look amazing." "Thanks," she said, her cheeks flushing as she stepped onto the porch. Dean appeared behind her, a mischievous glint in his eye. "Don't wait up, Dad," Daphne said, just like she would tell him when she was a teenager and tried to skip curfew, shooting him a playful grin. Dean chuckled, holding up his hands in mock surrender. "Wouldn't dream of it. Have fun." She walked down the steps toward Nolan, her nerves easing with each step. As they got into his car and drove off, she glanced back at the house, catching a glimpse of her father in the doorway, waving with a proud smile.